welcome to the Peak Endurance Podcast. My name is Isabel Ross and I'm the coach at Peak Endurance Coaching. Episode 54 is an interview with Stacy Sims, the author of the book Raw. Stacy T. Sims, Ph.D, is an applied researcher, innovator and entrepreneur in human performance, specifically sex differences in training, nutrition and environmental conditions. Prior to being launched into industry, she served as an exercise physiologist and nutrition scientist at Stanford University from 2007 to 2012, where she specialised in sex differences with environmental and nutritional considerations for recovery and performance, specialising in women's health and performance. With the unique opportunities Silicon Valley had to offer, during her tenure at Stanford, she had the opportunity to translate earlier research into consumer products and a science-based layperson's book, Raw, which was written to explain the sex differences in training and nutrition across the lifespan, and there are many. Both the consumer products and the book challenge the existing dogma for women in exercise, nutrition and health. This is a book I have myself and I highly recommend it, for men and women alike. Her contributions to the international research environment and the sports nutrition industry has established a new niche in sports nutrition and established her reputation as the expert in sex differences in training, nutrition and health. A regularly featured speaker at professional and academic conferences, including those hosted by US Olympic Committee, High Performance Sport New Zealand and USA Cycling, she is a senior research associate at AUT University and resides at the beach in New Zealand. I'm not even going to bother trying to say the location, I can't pronounce it, with her husband and young daughter. Times are tough at the moment, and if you are injured or have persistent niggles stopping you from running, they can feel even tougher. Come in and see the specialist at Health and High Performance. They're still open and they will utilise the latest in technology and experience to help you get back to your running best. So to get back to achieving the results you want and are capable of, head to www.healthhp.com.au/run or find them on Instagram, Health High Performance. I really hope you enjoy this interview with Stacy. I was so looking forward to doing this as I have loved her book for a long time. So I really hope you get a lot out of it and enjoy it. Hi, Stacy, and welcome to the Peak Endurance Podcast.
Hi, Isabel. How are you doing today?
I'm really good. How about you?
All right. Yeah, it started raining recently, so it's a bit gray, but
yeah. So you're in New Zealand, aren't you?
Yeah.
It's been Is it cold? I hear it's pretty cold there at the moment.
It is. It's I'm not a fan of winter, and I still have a hard time getting my head around the fact July is winter and not summer.
Of course. Yes.
So it's a hard sell, both cold, dark, and it should be summer.
Fair enough. Now, can you tell my listeners a bit about yourself, your athletic background, and how you got interested in female physiology?
Yeah. So, gosh, I started way back when as a ballerina. I was told I should probably think about switching to running instead. So I think I was getting too tall or gangly. Yeah. So I chose running and started running when I was 13 and was pretty active through my whole life. And when I got to university, I was on the rowing team and was training pretty hard and saw some discrepancies between what was happening with the guys with regards to their training and adaptation and race performance versus what the women's lightweight boat was doing. And we were effectively doing the same training. So at the same time at university in ex-phys and metabolism, started asking questions and really was not getting the answers. Like there were no answers. Yeah. They're like, women are anomalies. We don't know enough about women. Women have a menstrual cycle. We might study them, group them in with the men, and none of those answers were appropriate. They're still not, and I still hear them. Yeah. So when I was 18 or 19, this was the driving force of trying to find answers to help myself and my teammates. And I don't even want to say how many years later. It's been my academic and professional drive, because I've raced bikes at a high level. I've done Ironman at a high level. I did 20 marathons before I was 20. So huge endurance background. Yeah. Yeah, so it's just in the past about 3 or 4 years starting to see the uptake that women are not small men. We need to pay attention to physiology. How do we train our women better? How do we maximize performance? Which is exciting, but I'm like, gosh, it's 20 years in the making at least. So, but now getting uptake. Yeah.
Yeah, which is fantastic, and obviously why I want to talk to you because I have a podcast on endurance, and I coach clients, and I think it's really good for women to know that it is different for them. So, can you tell us the main ways? I'm sure there's many. The main ways that women differ from men as athletes.
So we know that there are sex differences from birth in muscle enzyme activity. Really important for female endurance athletes to understand that we are born from a XX point of view with more of the protein for fatty acid utilization. So it's not a hormone driven thing. We have more of the protein available for the mitochondria to use medium and long chain fatty acids. And so that's one of the inherent sex differences. There's also muscle enzyme activity sex differences, which precludes us from doing as many days high intensity activity as men. So you'll see it in training camps and stuff. You'll have women that are in the same level-ish kind of playing field as the men, and you might have 3 or 4 really intense days, and the women will be right at the front keeping pace for the first couple of days, and then day 3 they're like, ugh, starting to slow down. But then by about day 5 or 6 they pick it back up when the men start to slow down, and it has to do with enzyme activity and the protein, the mitochondria, the way that women's bodies respond. It has absolutely nothing to do with recovery and nutrition. It's just those inherent sex differences. And if we look at like the big picture, around the onset of puberty is when we start seeing really significant changes, and that's the epigenetic change we have with the exposure of estrogen, progesterone, and then for men, testosterone. And this is where we start to see those sex differences from a biological standpoint, where estrogen, progesterone, the menstrual cycle directly affects so many systems in the body. And then with testosterone being very anabolic and pushing lean mass development, bone development, even affects cognition, reaction, mood, aggression. You see this change inherently at puberty. And then as we are going through life, it's the menstrual cycle that really has an effect on performance with regards to when estrogen and progesterone are low, we recover better, our core temperature is lower, we have more blood volume available for cardiac output and for sweating, thermoregulation. We have a greater ability to access carbohydrate from our muscle and our liver, so we can hit intensities, we recover better. And then as estrogen and progesterone start to go up, this is where we start to see a lot of the changes in our training performance. And it's more of being aware, because I don't want people to say, oh, there's a negative time in my menstrual cycle for performance. It's just if you're aware of it, then you have that objective data. So knowing when estrogen and progesterone come up, there's more of an inflammatory response. Progesterone is very strong with pro-inflammatory cytokines, so it's harder to recover. It's also catabolic, so we need more protein. Our core temperature is elevated, so we need to think about how are we going to bring our core temperature down faster for recovery, or if it's a hot day, because there's sweat rate differences between the menstrual cycle phases. There's also cognition changes when estrogen crosses a blood-brain barrier. It affects neurotransmitters, so we get that brain fog and we have a slower reaction time. So knowing these things and allowing women to understand that things fluctuate across the menstrual cycle, you can do one of two things. One, you can schedule your training around these fluctuations once you have really good data on yourself. So that's why you have all these menstrual cycle tracking apps that are out, because you can pinpoint, how do I feel around ovulation? How do I feel 4 or 5 days before my period starts? So you start to get this objective data, and knowing that there are permutations in your hormones that will make you feel this way. So it's not your fitness, it's your physiology. You can start dialing in your training. But if you're looking from a race perspective and knowing that a race is on a certain day and you can't change the race according to your schedule, which we wish we could, it's knowing that there are certain nutrition things that you can do. Like using branched chain amino acids to get more leucine across the blood-brain barrier to affect the same receptor sites that estrogen do, to mitigate that central nervous system fatigue, to drink something that's icy cold before you go out on a long run or a hot run, to just drop your core temperature before you start, to salt your food during the taper week, to boost your total body sodium stores. Make sure that you're eating and drinking stuff with sodium in it, but not taking salt tablets because it's too much. But there's lots of little things that you can do to mitigate and level that playing field. But the first step is being aware.
Yeah.
And then when you think about like hormonal contraception, that's another ball game in itself as well, because we're looking at the different formulations. Is it an IUD? Is it an implant? Is it an oral contraceptive pill? And each one of those have a different exertional effect on the cells. So we know that the higher the concentration of estrogen, progesterone, the more our top end is muted. So we don't adapt very well to high intensity. We can't hit the VO2 peaks that we would like to. Our short interval training sessions are a little bit attenuated. You'll find time off the mark and track sessions are a little bit slower as well, harder to recover.
So this is while taking the pill just in general, not
yep.
at any specific point of the cycle, but the whole time.
Yeah, because primarily in Australia and New Zealand, you have what we call a monophasic pill. So it's 3 weeks of stable active pill, and then the placebo week. And a lot of people think the placebo week is a period, but it's not. It's a withdrawal bleed. And what happens with that is a woman's individual CYP gene, so that's the gene that metabolizes drugs, is a bit different. So you might have 2 days of a washout, and then boom, your estrogen comes back up. So it becomes a high hormone week. Or it might be 4 days. You don't know. So that placebo week is not a low hormone week either. So understanding that you have really high and then high, and trying to understand how do you mitigate these changes. But if you have an IUD or an implant, it's a progestin-only driven cycle. So you're still having your natural estrogen. So you're still having a natural cycle. And you can track that through basal body temperature or ovulation predictor kit. So there are different mechanisms to track. So yeah, it's when someone's on some kind of contraception, I want to understand why. Are you on it because someone told you to be on it? Because if you're an athlete and you didn't have your periods, you shouldn't be on a pill. If you have low bone density, you shouldn't be on a pill because it doesn't help with bone density. If you're looking for pure contraception, then yeah, there are different options. You don't have to be on the pill itself. And then we get into the other whole thing of perimenopause, menopause, which is another section in itself. But I might pause there because you might have some questions up to that point.
So you would recommend not going on the contraceptive pill if someone wants contraception. I mean, I personally was once put on a pill that completely stopped my periods because I didn't want a period because of racing. And then I did more research and find out, that being on the pill is unhealthy. What do you think of those kind of pills? I mean, is that much the same as well with the high estrogen?
So a lot of women are scared of an IUD because of some of the negative feedback that we've seen in the past, but they've redesigned it so it's smaller, it's more flexible. If you get an ultrasound guided implantation, then it's pretty good. Like, it's fail proof. It's on the top 200 medications deemed essential by WHO for pregnancy prevention. And a lot of women don't get their periods when they're an IUD, or they might get spotting every 3 to 4 months. But it's really reversible, and you still have your own estrogen and ovarian hormones working. So I try to get women towards that, or the implantin, which is your implant. When we're talking about heavy bleeding, IUD works for menorrhagia and heavy bleeding really well. If you're looking at not wanting your period, it's like, okay, well, is it not wanting your period because it's, quote, a hassle for racing? Because if it is, then we can look and see, well, if you're using something that's making everything a bit lighter, you're not going to get the same kind of negative cramping and that kind of stuff. I know there's some debate out there about having a period or not having a period. You'll see old white pharmaceutical doctor saying no one needs their period, and it was designed to mimic. That's why we have an active pill. And then you have the newer scope. It's like, well, actually you do need your period, not from a withdrawal bleed, but to make sure that your endocrine system is healthy, because if that's healthy, then you're a healthy athlete.
Yeah, well, I know many years ago I was amenorrheic, I think that's how you pronounce it, and I got stress fractures and those sorts of things. And I was, mid-30s, and I did not even realize that that's what periods were good for as an adult,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know. It's so not discussed. And a lot of girls, when they start running cross country in high school, right, and their periods are regular, or they might have really light periods and all of a sudden it's heavy bleeding, or they heard they should go on the pill for certain reasons, they just get put on a pill with no conversation around it. Or they had really irregular periods and then they stop. And so they think, oh, well, it's irregular, you need to be put on a pill to control it. But that's the exact opposite thing that should be happening. It's like, let's make sure everything's good and healthy, and then we can look at different options.
Yeah, and that's it. And I think that's when you can tell a female athlete is healthy, is when she's having a regular period.
Yeah, exactly.
What about athletes who have like irregular periods just naturally? How do they track it and work with that?
Yeah, so it's really normal, especially endurance female athletes having irregular cycles. The norm for women is 10 a year, not 12 a year.
Okay.
And we know that we can look at data from women who are in a heavy training phase versus, and maybe traveling versus.
Oh, you're breaking up.
Or postseason lower training phase, that their cycle does change. Oh, Can you hear me?
Yeah, I've got you now. Yep, that's okay.
Okay. So we know that when they're in that low phase of training, that their cycles become pretty regular. When in that high period of training, you'll start to see the follicular phase lengthening, just in response to the stress, if they're a healthy athlete. If they're not, and they're not eating enough, or they're getting into low energy state, they'll have what we call progesterone insufficiency or luteal phase deficiency that shortens up the period, and then it'll lengthen. So you start having these irregular periods. If you're not in a good energy state, you'll see a shortening and then a lengthening. But if you're healthy and you're traveling, you have a higher training load, then it'll become longer because that follicular phase is lengthening.
Yeah, and I guess it's tricky because a lot of women are under the misconception, I don't know, that being thinner and lighter is better, which can affect their periods too.
Yeah, for sure.
How do we encourage women to focus more on the health of their body rather than the weight?
And body weight, I know. So working with runners and cyclists, I see this all the time because it's all a power to weight ratio. So I'm always trying to tell them about strength. And I want my athletes to go into the race season a little bit heavier than what they want, because then they can afford to lose weight without getting sick, injured, or amenorrheic. So we focus really on the strength component and how strong you are, because if you have strength and develop the power through the strength, then it's not a weight issue. Because you'll see a lot of women who are like trying to be uber thin because they have this ideal weight that they think that's their performance. But they'll start fading in the second half of the race season. They'll get sick, they'll get injured. And so it's not really beneficial when you look at the big picture. Whereas if you go in strong and healthy and you start to lose a bit of weight along the way, you maintain your race kudos through the entire season without, getting that sickness and injury and amenorrhea. It is a fine line, but we really take the emphasis off weight and power to weight ratio and put it on pure strength and speed.
Yeah, I think that's a great focus. And with if women want to lose weight throughout their training, and are we still looking at calories in, calories out? What is your idea of how women should focus on their food?
Yeah, so we know that if you think about how many calories you need to eat, and this is typical of a woman who's working and racing and trying to do really well. So get up early, do a session,
Mm.
may or may not have breakfast. There's a bit of a delay. Then they have time to eat. And then they're really busy at work. Then they have kids stuff, or maybe they don't have kids stuff. They have after work stuff. Then they finally get to dinner, have a big dinner, go to bed and repeat. But the
Yeah.
problem with that is there's a really big hole between the time that they finish training and the time that they eat. So they're in this great catabolic state or breakdown state, which is the same response in the body as if you don't eat at all, or you are in low energy availability. So the way that we look at it is, if you do that and you think you're eating enough from a calorie in, calorie out, but you're bookending it on either side of the day or pushing it towards night,
Yeah.
you're going to gain weight because your body's in that breakdown state for such a long time it gets into conservation. So we talk about fueling for what you're doing. So you can moderate carbohydrate intake if you're having a lower intensity day versus a higher intensity day. And if you're fueling for what you're doing in or around training and stopping that breakdown state, then you can look to times away from training, maybe not having a pre-dinner snack or not having dessert. So you're taking out maybe 200, 300 calories towards the end of the day.
Mm.
That's not around training. And this is how we facilitate body fat loss and weight loss without getting into a low energy state. Because it's not about calories in, calories out.
Yeah.
If it is a public burden aspect and someone's trying to lose weight and they're not exercising, then yeah, it's calories in, calories out.
Yeah.
But when you're looking at women who are exercising at a higher intensity with a focus and they're doing it every day, it becomes the timing and the quality. So it's the timing in and around training, and then the quality and the nutrient density of everything else.
Now, does the nutrients that women need differ from that of men? Like, do we need more or less protein or carbs, those sorts of things?
So the recommendation, I think, is max of 1.8 to 2 grams per kilogram body weight for women, which is on the lower end when we look
Okay.
at what's going on. So for women, the 2 to 2.3 range is really beneficial. The lower end for low hormone, the higher end for high hormone, and peri and postmenopausal. It's all about amino acid availability, leucine crossing the blood-brain barrier. Carbohydrate, we're lower than men because we have estrogen and sex difference in muscle enzyme activity that allows us to access more free fatty acids. So we don't need as much carbohydrate.
Yeah.
And this is where people start to be like, oh, no carbs. I'm not saying no carbs. I'm saying, on low intensity days or recovery days, 3 grams per kilogram of body weight. On long run days or high intensity days, you're looking more of that 4 to 4.5 grams per kilogram of body weight. And that's a bare minimum. Of course,
Okay.
if you have double sessions or back-to-back high intensity days, you're looking a little bit higher. But the current recommendations that are out there of 5 to 8 grams is way too high for women.
Yeah, that's a lot. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And what about as a woman heads towards menopause? How does that change her nutritional needs?
Oh, so this is the interesting part where we know that all the body comp changes happen in perimenopause. So the weight gain of the serial fat gain, all of that stuff happens about 4 or 5 years before menopause actually is noticeable. So your late 40s. And then what happens in that time period, it kind of stays, because then after your period stop and you have a flat line of hormones, it's more of an age associated body comp change, not a hormonal change. Okay. So we're looking at the 4 to 5 years around, your late 40s, early 50s. You can get an idea of like when it might hit you by looking at your mom and your grandma, or if you're having symptoms. You're looking at more high intensity work, definitely hitting resistance training. You need to maintain muscle mass because estrogen is really critical for myosin. So myosin contractile strength within the muscle protein itself. And when the estrogen starts fluctuating, you get less of the stronger contraction, you get less of the myosin stimulation. So doing heavy resistance training keeps that. It's a neuromuscular thing. Okay. Moderating your carbohydrate intake, because we become more insulin resistant. So it's now looking at fruit and veg for carbohydrate intake, less of the quick hits, unless you're actually doing a long run and you need a quick hit of sugar, and hitting that protein, getting that top in, that 2.3 grams per kilogram body weight. Because it's all about trying to maintain lean mass, the integrity of the lean mass, and slowing down that visceral abdominal type body fat gain.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. And so, you're an advocate for strength training, as you've said, with as you're heading towards perimenopause and menopause. But it's important. Do you think it's important throughout a female athlete's career and life?
Yes. Yes, for sure. So there's two things about it. There's some studies coming out just this week about endurance and strength training from a long time habit and its effect on cardiovascular, bone, and muscle strength. So we know that the earlier you start resistance training, the more it's kind of ingrained in the neuromuscular pathway, and the less chance you have for losing lean mass when you get older. Same with bone. And from a cardiovascular standpoint, the more or the longer you've been doing endurance work, it changes the structure and the functionality of the heart. So you have less of a risk for cardiovascular disease when you hit menopause. So it's the additive years of resistance training and additive years of endurance training that are super beneficial for later in life. And then from a performance aspect, doing resistance training to build the weak muscles, eliminate muscle imbalances, really does so far with injury prevention.
Yes.
So the stronger you are and the more control you have, especially if you're trail running or ultra running or anything like that, your landing mechanics, you want to make sure those are nailed so you're not going to end up with an ACL risk or torn calf muscle or Achilles or hamstring. Because if you're imbalanced from resistance training and getting all of those things going, then you can keep going on in your running career.
And a lot of women are scared of bulking up, and that's really not an issue, is it?
No, it's not. It's not. It's really difficult for women to put on a massive amount of muscle mass unless they're mesomorphic or have PCOS, which they have a higher exposure and epigenetic aspect of testosterone. But for the normal woman, it's really difficult to put on muscle mass. Muscle strength, different story. So we can really build the strength of our contractions, and it has to do with the kind of weightlifting you're doing. So if you're doing the 0 to 6 rep heavyweight, low rep type work, you're going to get really strong contractile strength in your muscle. So you're going to be strong, but you're not going to bulk up. When you start doing that 10 to 12 rep range, more of that hypertrophy stuff, if you have that mesomorphic aspect or a genetic aspect for bulking up, you will put on more bulk than someone who doesn't. But you're not going to bulk up to Miss Olympia size.
No, especially not when you're doing endurance training. That's very difficult.
Right, exactly. You have to pick one or the other, right?
Yeah, exactly.
You want to put weight on, no endurance.
Yeah, that's it. Now, say, for instance, when you've got a race coming up and, I know we don't really carbo load anymore, but we tend to probably are having more carbs before a race. Does that change for women? Like, do they need more carbs before a race? Because I know most of that testing was probably done on men.
Yeah, and they have done some in women, seeing if they can increase glycogen stores.
Yeah.
And effectively, no, we can't. The way to top up your glycogen is really to make sure that you're eating adequate protein and carbohydrate after every session. So in a training week, when you're looking at putting more carbs in, again, every time you go out for one of your sessions during taper week, you make sure that you're recovering well. Even if it's a 20-minute, like 20 minutes is enough to release some of the glycogen, get a little bit depleted. And then, make sure that you're just staying on top of the refueling, and you're not going to bed low. So you're not sleeping low and training low and all that kind of stuff. But from a glycogen loading perspective, women just can't do it as well as men can. So it's more, what are you eating during the week and when are you eating it?
And what about during the race with race food, and, the engineered foods versus real foods? And also, I know that you're prefer to separate nutrition from hydration. Can you talk to us a bit about that as well?
Yeah, so the reason why I've always said like hydration and then food is limited
Yep.
with you or
Sorry.
drink.
Can you
So you
just
want to
say
make
that
sure
bit
that it works.
again?
You want to make, oh,
Just say that
oh,
last sentence
sorry.
again. You kind of lost you for a sec there.
Yeah. I say hydration because there's you can bring with you or that's available or that you can actually process. So you want to make sure that it works for you. And then when you're talking about food, you want to be able to eat for what the terrain is, what the temperature is, what and what kind of food that you're eating. When we talk about using gels, liquid carbohydrates, that kind of stuff, it ends up being a massive amount of carbohydrate in the gut that's compromised from not having blood flow. And there's sex differences in our ability to absorb a lot of the stuff that's in those gels and maltodextrin and fructose-based engineered products. We, as women, can't absorb as much fructose as men.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So we end up with more of what we call a brush border effect, where the fructose hangs out in the small intestines and causes a lot of the gas and bloating. And during that time, there's water coming from other spaces to dilute the pressure that's being built up. So it's more of an effective dehydration.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so then people are like, oh, I'm dehydrated, I'm gassy, and maybe I need salt tablets, and you don't need salt tablets. So it just becomes this like compounding variable. It's like,
Yeah.
oh, I'm doing all this carbohydrate. Oh, I'm getting dehydrated. I'm going to take more carbohydrate drink. It's not working. I'm cramping, salt tablets, and it's all building up
Oh,
in the
wow.
small intestines, and your body's like, no, can't handle it.
Yeah. So what should women have? I mean, myself, I like to have basically mainly real food. Is that
Mm-hmm.
sustainable, do you think, to have real food when racing?
Yeah. And it also depends on intensity. Like if you're going to do a 10K road race, then you don't
Yeah,
really
no,
need fuel. You just need
no.
hydration, right? But if
Yeah,
you're doing anything half marathon on up, ultras, right? So half marathon, you might be able to get by with energy chews or
yeah,
little, dinosaur bites or what is it? Nature's confectionery candy, little lollies.
yeah,
But
yeah,
when you start getting marathon and above, you need to think about having little bliss balls that are low fruit based. So it could be protein powder and brown rice syrup combination with some nut butter.
yeah,
You can do little bits of bread, something that's easy, digestible. And a lot of people are like, I can't chew while I'm running, can't chew while I'm racing. Well, it depends on the intensity. And you
yeah,
practice and practice and practice, and then it works.
yeah. Yeah, so the main thing is to practice so that you know what you can have and chew, I guess, as well.
Yeah.
Now, what are your thoughts on fasting and fasted runs and those sorts of things for women?
I'm not a fan. When I look at the literature on fasting,
Mm,
um, we have to put that dividing line between what like the fitness industry has pushed our way and what's real. So we know that if you are not exercising and you're trying to get the long-term bits of longevity, then fasting can work for you. But
okay,
if
yeah,
we're looking from a human performance and athletic standpoint, fasting does not work for the fact that for women and men, we both have a neuropeptide called kisspeptin. And kisspeptin is responsible for pretty much signaling our endocrine system for our sex hormones to work. If we are exercising in a fasted state, it perturbs the body and kisspeptin is downregulated. So then you don't get the stimulation for a normal endocrine system. And when you're thinking about all the reasons that people want to fast, to increase telomere length, to increase reliance on free fatty acids, to become, quote, metabolically efficient, all those things already happen with exercise. So we know that for sure, that all the exercise data mimics the fasting data, but it's stronger. And then the other side is women are already at their max fatty acid oxidation capacity by the nature of having a sex difference in the muscle with the predisposition to being able to process more of the fatty acids, and estrogen, because estrogen spares glycogen and increases free fatty acid use. So we're already at that max capacity. And all we see from the fasted and the low carb literature is that performance just takes a big hit, and women get sick, they become amenorrheic, and then they put on body fat and they're wondering what's going on. So fueling is beautiful. Carbohydrates are beautiful.
Yeah. And there's nothing more miserable than doing a fasted run, to be honest.
I know. You're like, oh my gosh. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I've tried it and I didn't like it, so I don't do it.
Good work.
Yeah. And is there anything else that you think female athletes would benefit from knowing? Are there some things that I maybe haven't touched on, or anything that you think would be worthwhile?
A lot of female athletes have issues with iron and iron absorption and anemia, and they'll try taking iron tablets and it's not working. They might be an infusion and then they bottom out. And it's not about the iron per se, it's about not being able to absorb it. So with endurance exercise, you have progressive inflammation. And across the menstrual cycle, you also have a higher level of inflammation in the late luteal phase or the high hormone phase. And whenever you have inflammation, you're also upregulating hepcidin. It's an enzyme responsible for slowing down the absorption of iron.
Okay.
So if you're in a constant inflammatory state, you have more hepcidin, which inhibits your gut from absorbing iron. What we do know from work actually in Australia, from Peter Peeling's lab, is if you take vitamin D3 after exercise, it drops that inflammation and allows your body to absorb iron.
Oh, that's really interesting.
Yeah.
That's excellent.
So, if you're on the cusp of anemia or low iron stores, low ferritin, and you're still on the low end of normal, and your doctor's like, nah, you're still on the low end of normal, which I hear a lot from female athletes, right? And then you get into a heavy training block, and then your iron starts getting even further on the low end, but they still won't do anything. It's taking the vitamin D3 and then a high dose iron once a week to help boost iron circulating and to make sure you're actually absorbing it.
What about female athletes who are vegetarian or vegan? Do they need to have any special considerations for their diet?
Not so much vegetarian, but vegan, you need to make sure that if you're doing plant-based protein powders, that you're boosting it with some vegan branched chain amino acids to get the leucine level up. Because a lot of the plant-based proteins are low in leucine, and a lot of the amino acids might not be bioavailable because they're wrapped up with fiber. So it's just being a little bit more conscious that you're getting high leucine intake from different foods. And if you are having a reliance more on plant-based protein powders, to boost it with a fermented vegan branched chain amino acid.
Yeah. And you've spoken about taking the branched chain amino acids and vitamin D3. Do you recommend women take other sorts of supplements at all? Or do you think we should just...
Not really.
Yeah.
Get some blood tests. If you're low on something, then, go the medical route. But for the most part, if you're eating a wide variety of foods, lots of colorful foods, you're going to get what you need.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'm just checking. What about injuries? Are women more susceptible to general injuries in running than men?
There's the kind of myth with a little bit of science behind ACL injuries and a greater rate of injury for women, but it has to do with the mechanics, not necessarily estrogen driven. So people think, around ovulation, you have a greater risk for ACL tear because estrogen decreases the tensile strength of the ligaments, which is true. But if you have the proper mechanics behind it, which we are not retaught around the onset of puberty, when our hips widen and we have a greater Q angle and our foot placement is different, then we are more at risk for injury. But if we work on our running mechanics, we work on our efficiency of movement, and we do the strength training to get that muscle balance, then our injury risk is low.
Yeah. Okay. That's good to know. And I mean, a lot of the testing that has been done on athletes is men, obviously, because like you said at the start, they said, well, women have periods and it makes it too difficult. No, women, is there being more research being done on women so that we can have a bit more of a broader range of knowledge?
Yes, I'm very excited
Awesome.
about that. Yep. There's been a lot coming out in the strength world in the past couple of years, which is how the phase-based training has come to be. There's more coming out in the endurance world, which is awesome. I know that there are 4 special topic requests for sex differences and female athlete considerations across the board. So there's a lot of interesting stuff that will be coming out in the next year or less. So I'm really excited about that. It's good.
Yeah. Oh, that's good.
Yeah.
That's good to know. And I know that you said women should have not as many high intensity days. If women are going onto the internet and grabbing training programs, well, firstly, should they, or how can they adapt them to maybe be more female specific?
So if we look at like a general training plan, and sometimes they'll have high intensity, then 2 recovery days. That's fine. 2 high intensity days in a row and then a recovery day. That's fine. But when you start looking at moderate intensity and then high intensity and then high intensity, then moderate intensity, which is a lot of things like go out for a 40-minute, endurance run, and then you have track day, and then you have tempo run day. So you see all of these things that are in there. You have 2 intense days and they're in 36 hours. So you might have 2 morning sessions and then an evening session. And then you can fall into that recovery standpoint that your body needs without moderating too much of the training program.
Yeah. So just basically ensuring that there is sufficient rest and easy days.
Yeah. Yep.
Yep.
And the best way to think about it is on day 1, when your period starts, that's kind of a signal of, sweet, now I'm primed for high intensity. So you can do high intensity, the 2 days on, 36-hour off kind of thing, until ovulation. And then around ovulation, you get to more steady state work, or the sweet spot, the 20-minute work.
Okay.
And then the 5 to 7 days before your period starts, we often look at this as a deload, where if you're have the ability to train and not race, which I don't think any of us are racing at the moment because of the COVID situation.
Sadly, yeah.
Right. That's the time to work on economy of movement, skills, technique on the bar. So it's not high weight. It's just all about technique and movement economy and mobility. Your body's a little bit fatigued from the way the hormones are affecting brain and reaction time. But if you're nailing technique and movement economy in that 5 to 7 day deload period, then when you get to the low hormone state, you're on. You're on because you have that motor pattern.
Yeah, yeah. And it makes sense to work with it rather than trying to fight
Exactly
the cycle. Yeah. Now, am I correct in believing that like women's balance changes with the hormone levels?
Some women will report that around ovulation and the 5 or so days before their period starts, they feel a bit uncoordinated. And this, again, is estrogen crossing blood-brain barrier. And this is where, if you are tracking, you'll know when these days are. So then you put steps into play, like, well, maybe I shouldn't go to the gym and do heavy lifting that day because I'm not that coordinated. Maybe I shouldn't go do a technical trail run because I don't really want to fall over. So just knowing where you are. But then, in those days before your period starts, where you're feeling like you're not balanced, is the time to work on it. So again, when you go out, right, and the other times of your cycle, you don't have issues with balance.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that sounds good. All right, well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you talking with me today. Where can people follow you or get more information or find your book, Raw, which is an absolute awesome book that I've read a number of times? Where's somewhere they can get all that information?
Oh, thanks. Where am I? I'm pretty much on all the social media platforms as Dr. Stacy Sims, and we're launching a comprehensive website that's still drstacysims.com. There's a placeholder with information on it, but it's being revamped and renovated to be relaunched towards the end of the month.
Okay. Yes. Yep. All right. No worries. Well, I'll put links for that in the show notes. And yeah, once again,
Thanks.
thank you very much. I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, it's been fun.
Bye.